freedom of speech is the foundation for our democracy. And what we've seen here is federal government putting extraordinary amounts of pressure both on Twitter and Facebook. And we haven't talked about Facebook, but we now know that we have the White House demanding that Facebook take down factual information, and Facebook doing that. And with Matt's thread this morning, we saw the government contractors demanding the same thing of Twitter. Accurate information, they said, that needed to be taken down in order to advance a narrative. But what we saw was a huge amount of FBI communications to Twitter. We saw the former deputy chief of staff, the former general counsel showing up at Twitter right at the critical period. So I find a lot of suspicious activity. I would like to ask him a bunch of questions about that because I find it very suspicious and unresolved.
There was a significant quantity of people who had come from the intelligence world or who had worked at state agencies. In fact, that was a very common method by which members of people who are currently working in government would reach out to Twitter. For instance, we found an email by a current State Department official who reached out to a former State Department official asking that 14 ordinary Americans have their accounts deleted. That was in a recent Twitter Files release. So yes, there's an extraordinary number of these people. A lot of them come from the intelligence world, which we did find unusual, I think. There were a couple of very telling emails that we published. One was by a lawyer named Sasha Cardile, where the company was being so overwhelmed by requests from the FBI, and in fact, they gave each other a sort of digital high five after one batch, saying that was a monumental undertaking.
And one of them we just discovered recently, which is that there was a Stanford Cyber Policy Institute report, which said that, which was in menacing terms, telling journalists that they should abandon the Pentagon principle. Again, this is the Pentagon Papers principle. This is the idea that if Daniel Ellsberg brings you materials he's taken from the Pentagon about how the war in Vietnam is going, the New York Times and Washington Post published those. That was considered one of the greatest moments of American journalism. Here you have Stanford Cyber Policy Center saying we should abandon that principle. You should instead make the issue about, frankly, the theories about where it might have come from. Then you had the Aspen workshop, which was attended, by the way, by New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, Wiki, Facebook, Twitter, many other journalists, where they basically, you read it, it's like a kind of programming of the journalists that they should not follow this longstanding journalistic principle of taking materials from a hack and leak or any other situation and take them seriously. So, I mean, you read this and it feels like a kind of brainwashing exercise that Aspen Institute and Stanford were running against American journalists and the social media companies. Reading through the whole sweep of events, I do not know the extent to which the influence operation aimed at pre-bunking the Hunter Biden laptop was coordinated. I don't know who all was involved, but what we saw was you saw Aspen and Stanford many months before then saying, don't cover the material in the hack and leak without emphasizing the fact that it could be disinformation. Okay, so they're priming journalists to not cover a future hack and leak in the way that journalists have long been trained to, with in the tradition of the Pentagon Papers, made famous by the Steven Spielberg movie. They were saying cover the fact that it probably came from the Russians. Then you have the former general counsel to the FBI, Jim Baker, the former deputy chief of staff to the FBI, both arriving at Twitter in the summer of 2020, which I find what an interesting coincidence. Then when the New York Post publishes its first article on October 14th, it's Jim Baker who makes the most strenuous argument within Twitter. Multiple emails, multiple messages saying this doesn't look real. There's intelligence experts saying that this could be Russian disinformation. He is the most strenuous person inside Twitter arguing that it's probably Russian disinformation. The internal evaluation by Yoel Roth, who testified in front of this committee, was that it was what it looked to be, which was that it was not a result of a hack and leak operation. And why did he think that? Because the New York Post had published the FBI subpoena taking the laptop in December of 2019, and they published the agreement that the laptop computer store owner the computer store owner rather, had with Hunter Biden that gave him permission after he abandoned the laptop to use it however he wanted. So there really wasn't much doubt about the provenance of that laptop. But you had Jim Baker making a strenuous argument. And then, of course, you get to a few days after the October 14th release, you have the President of the United States echoing what these former intelligence community officials were saying, which is that it looked like a Russian influence operation.
Yeah.
So they were claiming that the laptop was made public by a conspiracy theory. And the conspiracy theory that somehow the Russians got it, and they convinced Yoel Roth that they convinced him of this wild hack and leak story, that somehow the Russians stole it, got the information, gave it to the computer store, and it was bizarre. So you read that chain of events, and it appears as though there is an organized influence operation to pre-bunk.
Why?
The most important fact to know is that the FBI had that laptop in December 2019. They were also spying on Rudy Giuliani when he got the laptop and when he gave it to the New York Post. Now, maybe the FBI agents who were going to Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook and to Twitter executives and warning of a hack and leak, potentially involving Hunter Biden, maybe those guys didn't have anything to do with the guys that had the laptop. We don't know that.
I know.
But I have to say, as a newcomer to this, as somebody that thought it was Russian disinformation in 2020, everybody I knew thought it was Russian. I was shocked to see that series of events going on. It looked to me like a deliberate influence operation. I don't have the proof of it, but the circumstantial evidence is pretty disturbing.
Just quickly, we found just yesterday a tweet from the Virality Project at Stanford, which was partnered with a number of government agencies on Twitter, where they talked explicitly about censoring stories of true vaccine side effects and other true stories that they felt encouraged hesitancy. Now,
Censoring true.
Yeah, so they used the word true 3 times in this email. And what's notable about this is that it reflects the fundamental misunderstanding of this whole disinformation complex, anti-disinformation complex. They believe that ordinary people can't handle difficult truths. And so they think that they need minders to separate out things that are controversial or difficult for them. And that's totally contrary to what America's all about, I think. We yesterday discovered this email talking about the suppression of people telling their own stories of true vaccine side effects. So these are people who are telling about their own experiences, things that happen to them that are true, and they're being suppressed because what anti-disinformation does is the opposite of what the press does. They are aiming for what the narrative is, and they already know in advance what they're looking for, whereas a journalist goes into a story, does not know what the truth is. We often find that the thing we expect to find turns out to be completely different. They know in advance what they're looking for, and that's why this is so dangerous. Mr. Congressman, I would say that was a standard disclosure or a standard disclaimer in almost all the communications from the FBI to Twitter. There would usually be a line in there saying something like, for your consideration, we believe the following 207 accounts may have violated your terms of service. But notably, they very rarely focused on words like truth or inaccuracy. Very often, they used the words malinformation, misinformation, or disinformation. And so I think they were trying to shift the focus from one idea to the other. In conjunction with our own research, there's a foundation, the Foundation for Freedom Online, which, there's a very telling video that they uncovered where the director of Stanford's Election Integrity Partnership talks about how CISA, the DHS agency, didn't have the capability to do election monitoring, and so that they kind of stepped in to fill the gaps legally before that capability could be amped up. And what we see in the Twitter files is that Twitter executives did not distinguish between DHS or CISA and this group EIP. For instance, we would see a communication that said, from CISA escalated by EIP. So they were essentially identical in the eyes of the company. EIP, by its own data, and this is in reference to what you brought up, Mr. Congressman, according to their own data, they significantly targeted more what they call disinformation on the right than on the left by a factor, I think, of about 10 to 1. And I say that it's not a Republican at all. It's just a fact of what we're looking at. So yes, we have come to the realization that this bright line that we imagine that exists between say, the FBI or the DHS or the GEC and these private companies is illusory, and that what's more important is this constellation of kind of quasi-private organizations that do this work. The Global Engagement Center certainly had ties to Hamilton 68.
It's Richard Stengel. You know who that is?
Yes, he's the the first head of the Global Engagement Center.
Exactly. He was the head of the Global Engagement Center at its creation, right?
He was, and in his book, Information Wars, there are a number of passages where he talks about creating a whole-of-government solution to the information problem. He hastened to say that he didn't want to create a, quote, information ministry, but what he was describing roughly approximates that. An example of this is a report that the Global Engagement Center sent to Twitter and to members of the media and other platforms about what they called the pillars of Russian disinformation. Now, part of this report is what you would call, I think you would call traditional, hardcore intelligence gathering, where they made a reasoned, evidence-based case that certain sites were linked to Russian influence or linked to the Russian government. In addition to that, however, they also said that sites that, quote, generate their own momentum and have opinions that are in line with those accounts are part of a propaganda ecosystem. Now, this is just another word for guilt by association. And this is the problem with the whole idea of trying to identify which accounts are actually the Internet Research Agency and which ones are just people who followed those accounts or retweeted them. Twitter initially did not find more than a handful of IRA accounts. It wasn't until they got into an argument with the Senate Select Intelligence Committee that they came back with a different answer. But she noted that she believed that the FBI was essentially doing word searches keyed to Twitter's terms of service, looking for violations of terms of service, specifically so that they could make recommendations along those lines, which we found interesting. That's a good question. Certainly the German Marshall Fund, which is the NGO that is at the top of the chain in this organization, it's the German Marshall Fund, then the Alliance for Securing Democracy, and then Hamilton 68. They're a federal contractor. They received over $1 million from the Department of Defense. The board of the Alliance for Securing Democracy has a former acting head of the CIA, a former deputy head of the NSA, a former chief of the DHS on it. So I do not. I think you cannot have a state-sponsored anti-disinformation effort and also without directly striking at the whole concept of free speech. I think the two ideas are in direct conflict, and this is a fundamental misunderstanding, I think, of a lot of the people who get into this world. Some of them, I believe, in a well-meaning way. I think they're actually trying to accomplish something positive, but they don't understand what free speech means and what happens when you do this. It undermines the whole concept that truth doesn't come from, isn't mandated, that we arrive at it through debate and discussion.
I'll just briefly add, this is very disturbing because what they're doing when they're putting these labels on there is they're actually also trying to discredit you. So it's not just, it's a form of censorship, but it's also a disinformation campaign. And I think what Matt said is really important to understand. I mean, you go from a situation where we were fighting ISIS recruiting, and then it was Russian disinformation. And now they're in a situation where they're wanting to censor true information, accurate facts, because they're worried that people might behave in ways that they don't want them to. That involves mind reading at a level that is grossly inappropriate. I mean, I worry even about making this defense because let's remember, the First Amendment protects our right to be wrong. It protects our right to lie. I mean, it's bizarre to me that we would need to make a defense of the First Amendment and remind people that we have a right to be wrong. And being wrong, as Matt was explaining, is a big part of being a human being and having a democracy. So this is disturbing and chilling, and you're absolutely right to be outraged by it. There needs to be a full truth and reconciliation that I hope everybody would appreciate having on this issue, because a lot of bad behavior has come out about what they've done.
There are a couple of moments in the Twitter files that really speak to a kind of larger problem. In the first Twitter files, we saw an exchange between Representative Rouhana and Vijaya God, where he's trying to explain the basics of speech law in America, and she seems completely unaware of what, for instance, New York Times v. Sullivan is. There are other cases like Bartnicki v. Vopper, which legalize the publication of stolen material. That's very important for any journalist to know. I think most of these people are tech executives, and they don't know what the law is around speech and around reporting. And in this case, and in 2016, you were dealing with true material. There is no basis to restrict the publication of true material, no matter who the source is and how you get it. And journalists have always understood that. And this has never been an issue or a controversial issue until very recently.
And by the way, just one quick thing I'll add, that's the exact same strategy of the malinformation, misleading. In other words, they were saying even if the material you think is true, it could lead people to have conclusions that we don't want them to have, and therefore you should change your journalism because of that. So this is, we're so far down the slippery slope, you've crashed at that point. I mean, it's a disturbing trend in journalism, in social media, and in the relationship from the intelligence community to these organizations.